evening. And on behalf of Massachusetts Peace Action and our other sponsoring organizations, Chicago Area Peace Action, Maryland Peace Action, Maine and New Hampshire Peace Action, I want to welcome you all to this, the first in a two-part conversation on learning the lessons of Afghanistan. We'll be presenting the second part of this discussion 3 days from now on Thursday, September 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern, and we'll put a link to that in the chat at the end of our conversation tonight. Before I introduce our esteemed panel, let me go over the general format and a few instructions about engagement. Each of our panelists will speak in turn to the lessons from their unique perspectives. After we've heard from all three, we'll open the floor for questions. Because it's difficult to see everyone at once on screen, I think we have almost 200 people here tonight. Please use the raised hand feature available at the bottom of the chat function so we can see that you have a question. Brian will call upon you so that you can ask your question in your own voice. Please keep your question in the form of a question so we might take advantage of the knowledge and wisdom available from our panelists tonight. If you have general comments and/or resources that you would like to share with the entire group, please use the chat feature to share those. What's happening right now is rather unique for the United States. Finally admitting that an extremely expensive, in dollars and lives, forever altered and lost, is no longer worth pursuing, is not the normal modus operandi for a nation that seems to use its military might at the drop of a hat and refuses to admit that every problem cannot be solved by the use of force. And thus, we believe this is an important and unique moment to look back and also look forward as we seek to influence US foreign policy in the future. And so we gather to explore, unpack, and learn the lessons of Afghanistan. We've chosen to frame this discussion around the following 7 points. The US must stop making war on Afghanistan. No drone strikes, no bombings, no special forces, and no aid to rebel groups. 2, engage with the Taliban and establish normal relations with the new government. Pay reparations to the Afghan people for the harm that we have caused, accept all Afghan refugees. 3, support regional diplomacy by convening Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and others to guarantee the neutrality and support the stability and development of Afghanistan. 4, clean house in Washington, D.C. Conduct a thorough investigation of the lies, fraud, and mismanagement. Remove all the lying and incompetent generals and national security officials who managed the war for the past 20 years. And other US interventions in the Middle East by withdrawing troops from Syria and Iraq, ending arms sales and military assistance to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Israel, ending sanctions on Syria and Iran, and rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. 6, repeal the 2001 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force. Pass the National Security Powers Act, Senate Bill 2391, to ensure that any future military interventions, arms sales, and sanctions are approved by Congress and have limited terms. And finally, deeply cut the Pentagon budget and use the funds made available to resettle refugees, launch a global COVID-19 vaccination drive, greatly reduce inequality in our country, and address the climate catastrophe. And now we turn to our panelists to speak to these points or extrapolate from their own perspective lessons that we should and must learn from this costly misadventure. First, I'd like to introduce Valentine Mokadam. Val is a professor of international affairs and sociology. She's the author of Modernizing Women, Gender and Social Change in the Middle East in 2013, Globalization and Social Movements, Islamism, Feminism, and the Global Justice Movement in 2012, and other books and journal articles. Her research areas include globalization and development, transnational movements, the political economy of gender in the Middle East and North Africa, revolutions and social movements, and citizenship. A native of Tehran, Iran, she is a member of MAPA's board of directors and of its Middle East working group. Her article, Afghanistan's Tragedy, was written in May 2021, and I think we can drop a link in the chat to that article. Val, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, although I wish the circumstances were different and better. And I just want to begin by, expressing my sorrow over the deaths of the Afghan children and the other civilians who happen to have been killed, actually, by a U.S. drone. As we say in Persian and Dari, Ruhishun Shad. Thank you, David, for reading out MAPA's 7.7 demands, basically. And I want to elaborate on them by drawing attention to 4 sets of issues within the allotted time. And I want to begin with a little bit of history and context, because I think that's important for people to understand the kind of country that that the U.S. began intervening in, and the kind of country that we're talking about today as well. So when we're speaking about the historical context, I think a key question is really what national and international forces and factors helped create these decades of conflict and crisis in Afghanistan. What I have done in my own research is first to look at Afghan social structure and internal political developments in the 19th to the early and mid 20th century. And this includes, for example, the role of Britain during its colonial era, including the 2 Anglo-Afghan wars, which occurred in the early 1800s and then in the late 1800s. So there was a lot of that early intervention on the part of Great Britain. This was followed actually by some modernization and reform and development efforts under various Afghan kings, for example, Abdul Rahman Khan, Habibullah, and especially Amanullah in the early 20th century. But there were always serious obstacles to state building and to national security and national unity. And those obstacles were internal: tribes, clans, property landowners, etc. And of course, the external intervening powers, first Britain, and then of course, the United States. So fast forward to, for example, the mid 20th century, and then we see the role of the UK and the US in the Middle East and Central Asia during the Cold War. After the 1953 coup d'etat in Iran, which was, of course, fomented by the UK and the US, an organization called CENTO was formed. That was the Central Treaty Organization, also known as the Baghdad Pact, a military alliance formed in 1955 that was comprised of Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, and the UK and the US joined in 1958. It was dissolved in 1979. But what it was an effort to keep communism out of South Asia and to keep those countries in the US orbit. But it was also anti-communism that drove the Carter administration to destabilize what was a modernizing left-wing government that came to power in April of 1978. This was initially a covert operation to support and arm a tribal Islamist rebellion that started in the summer of 1978. But we need to acknowledge that the so-called Soviet invasion was actually a trap to lure the Soviets into a Vietnam-style quagmire, as Zbigniew Brzezinski actually admitted in an article in a French magazine in the late 1990s. So Afghanistan's peace, stability, security, and the physical security and advancement of Afghan women, all of this was sacrificed on the altar of US imperial designs, which, by the way, had the effect of strengthening a worldwide radical Islamist movement. In other words, the US was opposed to what was going on in the Islamic Republic of Iran, And yet, at the same time, it was supporting an Islamist uprising in Afghanistan. So I have discussed a lot of these issues in that article that David mentioned, which is posted on the MAPA website, but also in various of my writings in the late 1980s, the early 1990s, and also, that book, Modernizing Women, there's a chapter on Afghanistan, and the first edition was written in 1993. So you can get photographs, you can get the whole background and history there. Okay, that was my first point about historical context. So let me move on to my second point about 20 years of US military presence in Afghanistan. What was accomplished? The US invasion, and we have to call it an invasion. I mean, there's all this talk about the Soviet invasion, but of course the Soviets were invited. The US was not invited in 2001. In any event, the US invasion, bombardments, and occupation that started in October 2001 has been justified as a necessary response to the assaults of 9/11, given that the Taliban were harboring Osama bin Laden and refusing to give him up. And Osama bin Laden was held responsible for 9/11. So whether or not that was the real reason, or whether it was really about trying some way to get that energy pipeline from Uzbekistan through Afghanistan, that's less important than the fact that the US invaded and began a 20-year occupation. That is to say, the hegemon of the world system is now bombing and occupying a poor, underdeveloped third world country. And note that this is the true invasion, unlike the so-called Soviet invasion, which, as I said, had been requested by elements of the Afghan ruling party in the context of US-led covert action. According to the Afghanistan papers, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who have read the Afghanistan papers, there's a lot to read there, and I can't say that I've read them all, but I have read several of the sections. The invasion, it's very critical. The Afghanistan papers point out that the invasion and occupation were devoid of strategy and goals. There was next to no knowledge of Afghan history, the local languages, the cultural practices, and the US government officials consistently lied about progress. The Hamid Karzai government was unable or unwilling to engage in building institutions, trust, legitimacy, and unity, and was beset by electoral fraud and corruption. Karzai himself had been based in Pakistan and was a fundraiser for the Mujahideen rebellion during the 1980s. And he continues to have a rather erratic set of political tendencies. During this time, poppy production continued, much to the dismay of neighboring Iran, which has suffered high addiction rates from cross-border drug smuggling. So, during this 20-year occupation, the Taliban resurgence of 2006 resulted in US troop surges and drone strikes that only added to the people's physical insecurity and to the illegitimacy of the central authorities, not to mention the US and the NATO forces themselves. Meanwhile, the Taliban were gaining strength in the south and eastern part of the country, and they were constantly aided and abetted by whom? A US ally, Pakistan. Zalmay Khalilzad, the US spokesperson on Afghanistan across 3 administrations, also, by the way, a former employee of that California-based company that wanted to extend that energy pipeline from Uzbekistan through Afghanistan, Unocal. He had been a former Unocal employee, and he had been pushing for that pipeline during the late 1990s when the Taliban were in power. Meanwhile, he has consistently exaggerated, lied, and misled the American public about the situation in Afghanistan. I mean, he was doing that until just last week, practically. So the August 2021 withdrawal was a unilateral US decision begun under former President Trump, and it was done without consultation with European allies and the Afghan government, let alone neighboring countries like China, Russia, India, and the Central Asian states, all of which have a stake in the peace, security, and stability of Afghanistan, which itself is very much linked to peace, security, and stability of the region. So in that way, President Biden adopted his predecessor's approach of unilateral action. No consultations, no return to the Iran nuclear deal, which, by the way, could have been the basis for a broad regional agreement on Afghanistan's future. President Biden, in his first address after the Taliban takeover, which I found his address quite heartless, actually, blamed the collapse on the Afghans, the Afghan government, the military, and yet the US itself has been largely at fault. Very little of that much vaunted $1 trillion or other estimates, $2 trillion went towards reconstruction in Afghanistan and building up of the security forces. The vast majority came back to the US. The vast majority of the money that the treasure, as Biden put it, that the US spent, came back to the US in the form of salaries, healthcare, pensions for US military personnel, payments to private US contractors, and allocations to US corporations for the purchase of weapons. Despite President Biden's denigration of the Afghan government and security forces, we have to acknowledge that the Afghan military took huge hits over the past 20 years, and government officials were often targeted for assassination. Still, it should be noted that many Afghan soldiers were under the command of, either foreign officers or VEMA local commanders. And the central government, whether Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani, never acquired the national reach, legitimacy that any state needs to govern effectively through the people's trust and loyalty. Meanwhile, the US never engaged in the large-scale economic, social, and infrastructural development that would have created a more sustainable form of governance and social order, not to mention winning hearts and minds. For example, just last year, 2 years ago, 2019, the total donor aid to Afghanistan for educational programs came to a measly $312 million, or a meager $20 per child for Afghanistan's 15 million school-aged children. By contrast, the US spent around $1 million per year per soldier for the thousands of US soldiers in Afghanistan. $20 per year for Afghan children, $1 million per year for US soldiers. This is why all that trillion or 2 trillion came back to the United States, in fact. So overall, and across the 20 years of US occupation, actually less than 2% went towards the necessary social, economic, and infrastructural development that Afghanistan needed to build a social base for example, self-governance, for its self-reliance, and so on. So as the world witnessed, the withdrawal this month was astonishingly shambolic, abandoning, for example, the Bagram air base and essentially leaving it to the Taliban fighters. The US also executed a poorly planned and chaotic departure of its own forces and contractors, but especially of the Afghan interpreters and other allies. So this is the result of official lying and data manipulation over the years, as has been documented in the Afghanistan papers. And in my judgment, it really reveals the American empire in free fall and in serious decline. So a third point has to do with that terrorist attack at the airport on just a few days ago on the 26th by ISIS Khorasan. Who's ISIS? Look, ISIS is the direct outgrowth of US foreign policy, specifically the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, regime change in Libya, and the destabilization of Syria. Through its decades of anti-communist obsessions and through the destabilization of states it did not like, the US helped to spawn a Frankenstein's monster that continues to show its ugly face in various countries across the globe. Now, I'm not sure how Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Israel regard ISIS, but ISIS is perceived as a terrorist organization and an existential threat by other countries, notably Iran, whose eastern borders are now at risk. And as I mentioned, the porous border between Iran and Afghanistan enables a narcotics trade that has created a very serious social problem inside the country. Iran is likely to work with Russia and China to make sure that Islamist terrorists do not expand their reach and that the flow of opium and heroin is halted. It might also try, in that respect, it might also try to reach some kind of modus vivendi with the new Taliban government. So let me end on my fourth point, which is what is to be done, as Lenin wrote. Now, US decision makers, if they cared about anything other than their own immediate national security and economic interests, they would help broker a region-wide plan for peace and security that would include consultations and cooperation with Iran, Russia, China, India, and other partners for reconstruction, reconciliation, and social and economic development of Afghanistan. In addition to attention to the rights of women and girls, the Shia Hazara need protection from Sunni and Pashtun extremists, and they need to be part of an inclusive government. I have written in the past that the UN mandate for administration for Afghanistan, UNAMA, it should be extended and expanded. There should be a UN monitored trust fund for Afghanistan's immediate humanitarian needs, but especially for its longer term social and economic and infrastructural development for peace building and stability. And this trust fund has to be financed by the US, NATO partners, and the world's other rich countries that have been involved in the decades of destabilization and war. And of course, Afghanistan's neighbors, Iran, India, China, etc., should be centrally involved in the development, training, and educational and diplomacy efforts. I also think that there should be a full inquiry into the debacle of August 2021, but also into the past 20 years, or dare I say the past 40 years, of American involvement in Afghanistan. And it should not be a whitewash like the so-called Iraq Study Group report of 2006 was. There needs to be accountability and justice for the families of those Americans who needlessly served and died, for those Afghans who naively put their faith and hopes in the US presence, and for the country as a whole, which remains mired in conflict, chaos, and underdevelopment. And finally, the American people need to hold their leaders from both parties accountable for the long history of disastrous American military engagements and state destabilization. And they must insist that the US should henceforth conduct a peaceful and cooperative foreign policy, should reduce military spending while increasing social spending in the US and increasing development cooperation internationally. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Val, for that fabulous history. History we should know, but is never really discussed in our war cheerleading mainstream media. All right. I want to comment, but I want to move the program along. Next time, it's my pleasure to introduce Erik Edstrom. Erik grew up in Stoughton, Massachusetts, graduated from West Point in 2007. Erik was deployed to Afghanistan, where he served as an infantry platoon leader, spent the remainder of his service as the presidential escort platoon leader during the Obama administration. He's a graduate of the U.S. Army Ranger School, recipient of the Ripito Trophy during the Best Ranger competition, and was selected for the U.S. Special Forces and awarded the Bronze Star Medal. After the military, Erik went on to earn both an MBA and a Master of Science, studying climate change from Oxford University. After grad school, Erik moved to Australia for 5 years, where he worked as a management consultant for both Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey. He lives in Boston and is a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. In his book, Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning for Our Longest War, he explains how blind support for war exacerbates the problems that it's intended to resolve, devastates the people allegedly being helped, and diverts assets from far larger threats like climate change. Erik, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And thank you, Valerie. To everyone here, thank you so much for taking a bit of time out this evening to join us. It's apropos. I have been very much plugged in to everything that is happening these days in Afghanistan. I have, in a way, sort of rejoined, if only briefly, my military colleagues, as they have put forth a tremendous amount of effort round the clock in this frenetic frenzy of attempts to get our Afghan interpreters and other Afghan allies, as well as American citizens, out of the country after an absolute catastrophically disastrous evacuation process led by the US. And I have been a part of that for basically the last sort of 10 days. I was invited into sort of one of these secret spook signal groups to try to help coordinate getting American citizens to the gate and to fill in the gaps and the holes of where there's been absolutely no coordination whatsoever. And it's been truly disastrous to see the effects of poor planning, and especially poor military planning, which, unlike some other forms of public service, reverberates and ripples through society much more deeply and causes much more damage than perhaps other forms of service. And so when the military tries to get out of Afghanistan in a way that is extremely detrimental, it causes a lot of extra harm to the rest of society. And I've seen that through glimpses in these discussion groups and everything else. So I'll take a few minutes to talk about that, and then I'll actually sort of get to the major prompt, which is some of the lessons learned. But because I've spent basically all of my waking hours outside of work trying to help my interpreter get out, I feel a certain debt that I should explain what that situation entails. And it sort of, I think, can go back to the beginning, which I don't think anyone here, given that this is mass peace action, would object to the idea that going into Afghanistan with a large conventional footprint to occupy the country for 2 decades was a good idea. I certainly don't think that was the case either. I was, absolutely in favor and wrote a book about it, obviously called Un-American, about getting out of Afghanistan and ending that war. And I knew about that and felt that very personally over a decade ago in 2009 and 2010 when I was deployed. But given that this is where we are now, and you need to get out of the country, you would like to do so in a way that causes the least amount of additional damage to the people that live there and the least amount of damage to those that have served with us, and that we still owe some moral obligation to take care of, because we strung them out and we've strung them along for years with the expectation that they would eventually come to the United States. And so rather than doing appropriate capacity planning as a country, as a military, and to plan this, we did not look at the number of people that needed to be evacuated by location and sort that out so that you knew how many and what type American citizens, P2 visas, SIVs by region. We could have used those regional airports to get those interpreters that have been in bureaucratic purgatory through the State Department awaiting their visa, we could have gotten them out safely over time, and we didn't. And so what happened as the US collapsed their regional bases and gave up and fled those and left only a single point in and out of the country, at Kabul airfield, at Hamid Karzai International Airport, is that you've forced people like my interpreter, who had to go across the country from Taliban-controlled Kunduz in the middle of the night to get to Kabul. And day after day, I've been trying to support him from over here to help him try to get through a gate and get on a manifest to get out of the country. I've called Congressman Lynch's office many times before. I met with him in 2017. I literally talked to the man about the same interpreter and the same problem and the same bureaucratic purgatory he was facing with the special immigrant visa in his office at Rayburn House on Capitol Hill in 2017. It is now 2021, and the same man is still stuck in the visa process with the State Department, and he is not on a plane, and he was left behind by the United States. So there's a, I'm happy to point fingers when it comes to the war and how it was completely negative sum. But in the last couple of weeks, that has not been my objective. My objective has been trying to get those people to safety. And I think the coalition of veterans, community organizers, human rights advocates, there's people from UNICEF, there's former, chief of staff from the cabinet secretary, basically, is part of the same group. And I think there's a tremendous sense of failure and betrayal that at the end of these 2 decades of conflict, we couldn't even have the common decency as a country to bring our allies home. And we've left them to figure it out on their own. And it's not going to be a pretty situation. I was on MSNBC on Saturday and talked very briefly on a short spot about what I've been participating in. And from a White House correspondent who went on background, could not give her name, but that the State Department has been padding the numbers of the evacuees, counting not people on airplanes, rather they've been counting empty seats and counting seats on aircraft and making assumptions about what those occupancy levels are. And the people that are granted a visa were being counted, not the people that actually made it through the gates onto planes. And so I was told that if you look into, and I hope that there's a staff journalist at a major tier 1 paper that will look into it, but that the numbers don't match. So the number that the US claims was flown from Kabul to, say, Qatar, and the number that left Qatar to come to the US are vastly disparate. So there's a large portion that you're like, well, where did they go? Did suddenly there come this renaissance where the Qataris now want to take all these refugees? And the answer is no. The answer is that they were never there to begin with, and that the numbers that were reported are padded. That being said, depending on how one classifies an Afghan ally, on the sort of bottom end, we've left probably 75% of our allies behind. And if you're counting the broadest spectrum of Afghan allies that you could, which would include not only SIV applicants that are pending and those that have been approved and their direct family members, but if you keep going out another layer where you have, say their parents and other brothers and sisters, or if you include the P2 visas, like anyone that has served in the Afghan army or Afghan commandos or contractors to the US, that number can go up to about 1.2 million. So if we've evacuated 70,000 people, of which we still don't really know if that's the true number, out of 1.2 million, it's something less than or thereabouts near 7%. That means that on the broadest spectrum, if you draw a liberal line around what we consider an ally and who deserves to be evacuated and who doesn't, we've left 93% of our allies behind. And I think that that's absolutely shameful. So yes, there are a lot of lessons on here, but because I've been so deep in it, I also actually wrote an article for Politico last week, which I can drop in the chat bar here for everyone. I published this, I think, on Wednesday of last week, which got some decent traction. But it shows the absolute chaos on this side. And I think that there's almost, it was in some ways actually really nice to participate in that effort. And because it's sort of a somber tone, because the reason it was nice is because it felt a bit redemptive relative to all of the other things that I did in Afghanistan when I was deployed. And that here was something that felt uncontroversially human. That, what I could do in the last 2 weeks seemed like an absolute positive outcome for these people. And we didn't get that. So I'm still a bit shaken up from all of that myself. So it's been a hard time. I'm happy we're out of the country, but I think it was done in an absolutely disastrous way. To comment on some of the other lessons that were here, there's probably two that I want to add, actually. There's 7 here on the list. I think that there's probably room for 2 more, one of which would be around providing truth and transparency in US military greenhouse emissions, committing to the reduction targets in line with the 1.5 degree world, the Paris Accords, and then basically ensuring that out of the military budget for the cost of emissions, that you would claw that back for every ton that is emitted by the military and then reallocate that towards mitigation and abatement. So if, the more you spend in emissions, the less budget you get, and make that very clear that they're tied together. And then that forces the military to decarbonize quite quickly. I recognize that creates then the next generation of military industrial complex, which is basically then, oh yeah, this whole, climate change is a thing. We should absolutely decarbonize the military. Let us design for you an entire new fleet of EV trucks and MRAPs. So that will then pass it on, to the next generation costs as well. But nonetheless, it's still good to decarbonize, and I still think that they should pay the cost, because ultimately it doesn't matter where a ton of carbon is emitted. The atmosphere counts it all the same, whether it's from a C-17 or a pickup truck or from cattle farming and agriculture. So it all needs to be counted, it all needs to be assessed, and it should all be paid for the negative externalities. I'd say also number 9, another one I'd create, is show the world that the US actually believes in the rule of law and believes in justice by conducting a comprehensive, independent, third-party, a la ICC, International Criminal Court investigation to prosecute war criminals, and seek the full support to try to make amends for what has been done and what has been glossed over in the last 2 decades. The other 2 things that I would say, to be more precise, and this might be contentious for some people, is that with number 2, pay reparations to the Afghan people for the harm we have caused. Frankly, I don't think that would work. And I actually would be against that, because I think we should pay for some of the reparations, not because we are callous, but because whatever the market rate is, and we should assess Afghan lives no different than our own, would be so expensive that it would bankrupt our entire country. That if you look at the cost it has been over 20 years, it is not due to a lack of caring, but the damage that has been done is so large, I don't even know how sort of the country would function. And if you want to play the sort of card of let's pay for reparations, where does it begin and end? I think that there's plenty of reason for reparations for women more broadly, or Black people more broadly. And then you're ending up basically making our country entirely insolvent because of past moral and actual crimes it has committed. So where I do think that there is probably some room, especially as I witnessed when I was in the military in Afghanistan, is that oftentimes the military would not pay out, or pay out in very paltry sums to people harmed by American vehicles, bombs, or accidents more broadly. And all of those people deserve to get paid. I think it's just an absolute nightmare to actually, in reality, do reparations for the country more broadly. So I think that that one's a bit tricky. And with respect to the accept all Afghan refugees, I would further refine that because sort of what is a refugee? It's been drilled into me for the last sort of 2 weeks that they're not refugees, that they're evacuees, and that refugees carry some negative connotations with certain people, and they, are more likely to be rebuffed in terms of welcome to their country. But I would say that all eligible Afghan evacuees, including special immigrant visas, those who are pending, their dependents and extended family, and anyone who is eligible for a P2 visa, which is a different classification, which would include sort of contractors, Afghan army, Afghan police, and anyone who had been providing services to the US military throughout this entire period of time. So those are my two additions, my two modifications, and a brief sort of digression on what I've been up to for the last couple of weeks. And I thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Erik. And thanks for those unique insights, especially for calling out the largest polluter and carbon contributor in the world, the US military. I don't know that anyone has the perfect answer for it, but calling out the problem is probably step one. And thank you for mentioning, and Valentine also for mentioning the investigations that never occurred in the wake of the Iraq debacle. And a friend of mine, Hassan El-Tayeb, who runs the Middle East Policy Desk at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, wrote recently, if careers are not destroyed over the lies and misinformation about Afghanistan, then we've got a problem. Anyway, and the delabeling of refugees. So thanks, Erik. I thought that was great.
If I could actually add one more thing, David, it's that
Sure.
I spoke at Veterans for Peace a couple of weeks back about military and climate change. And there was a study in Nature Communication, it was all over The Guardian, et cetera, which talked about lifetime emissions of US citizens. And it was a study that said, basically for every 3 US citizens, and there are 223 people here on this call, so we'll say that's roughly sort of 70. So for every 3, it's 3.5 US citizens over the course of their lifetime, they will emit enough emissions to kill one person somewhere else. And that's the social cost of carbon aspect. So the negative externalities associated with the emissions will be felt somewhere in the world. And because the US per capita footprint is so high, that effectively the people on this call, if we're all average polluters, have effectively killed 70 people somewhere else. So it's the magic number that the Social Cost of Carbon Project in Nature Communications said it's about 4,400 tons. Usually sort of an average American is between sort of 16 and 20 tons a year. If everyone lives 80 years, you do the quick back of the envelope math. The interesting thing connecting it to the US military is what is the military's emissions. And that is shocking. Science Magazine had, again, they don't report it, so it's really difficult. And that's why you need congressional action to have transparency in military emissions. One such group of scientists that were trying to estimate footprints based on JP8 and petroleum purchases and base estimations of 80 countries across the US or across the globe, basically ended up getting to a number, and it was in the hundreds of millions of tons over a several-year window, which would basically be the equivalent of an operating social cost of carbon of killing another 130,000 people. And that was just about like an 8-year span during the War on Terror. So the number of people who will eventually and likely forecasted to be killed from just the emissions alone is going to rival the actual number of people, according to Brown University's Watson Institute, that were killed from the war. So it almost makes war doubly costly in a human sense because of these carbon emissions.
Thanks, Erik. Thank you. So finally, let me introduce our third esteemed panelist, Fahima Gaiz. Grew up in Afghanistan and from an early age was involved with the women's rights movement there. After immigrating to the US, she continued to work for the people of Afghanistan from afar. In 2001, she founded the Afghan Women's Fund, and I think Brian's going to drop that link into the chat, in collaboration with another group, and in 2011, it was incorporated as an independent charity. FEMA continues today as its president, raising money to support schools for girls, cooperatives for women, clinics in rural areas, and more. Fahima has addressed the United Nations, has traveled widely to speak at university-based conferences, and has appeared on many national and international television and radio stations, including the BBC and NPR. She's been featured in various publications, including the Washington Post. Many members of Fahima's family still live in Afghanistan, and she travels there often to oversee the work of the foundation. So Fahima, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I want to thank Val for giving this elaborate history, and also thank you very much, Erik, for calling out on what really the mess that they have created and the mess that we are in, and really appreciate it. I'll be talking, since Val already talked about the history, the recent history of US involvement, I just want to add one little thing to it, is that US involvement in Afghanistan did not start with the Marxist government came to power. It started actually in 1974, when then government of Afghanistan nationalized banks and took some steps toward progress. Some progressive step that the then Afghan government took. So there were some, of course, thugs and thieves who left Afghanistan then, and the US decided to support it with the help of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. So that was the first group actually started in 1975 that were formed in Pakistan. They were called Mujahideen, which they were also called by Afghan Ashrar. Ashrar is the word, the Arabic word for terrorist. They were, and then when the leftist, the Marxist government took over, and then when the Soviet came to Afghanistan, of course, those groups became much stronger, and more groups were formed, and Pakistan was more involved, and of course the US was more involved, and then billions and billions of dollars were given there by United States and much by the Saudis to use these thugs and thieves and the outcasts of the society to fight the Afghan government and any progress that was made in Afghanistan. And mostly because women's rights was on the right tracks, they were using the women movement and the women's emancipation to call the then government of Afghanistan an atheist government or a communist or godless or whatever, that they used their God and their version of Islam to fight the government. And of course, Erik said earlier that 200 some people aren't here in this group. Many of these people were the parents of these people contributed, of course, not knowing, but their tax money went to support the Mujahideen or the terrorists in Afghanistan against the collapse of Afghan government and against the emancipation of women in the Soviet Union. So Afghanistan became a battlefield between the Soviet Union and United States and also the regional power. What I'll be talking about the prospect on the ground, the prospect of Afghans, that they are very angry right now. I am in contact with hundreds of Afghans every day and talk to them. And I do not know if you heard my interview the other day. It was very emotional. I hardly could talk about what is going on in Afghanistan. So the people are telling me that the US kept using Afghans for 40 years. They have used Afghanistan against the progressive government in Afghanistan, against the Soviet Union. And then, from the after the first generation, after the Soviet Union left, the first generation of the terrorist Mujahideen came to power, and then the second generation, which is the Taliban, came to power, and then US went and got rid of the Taliban, and then when they brought back the same terrorists. It's like they are recycling, they're putting them in the trash somewhere, keep them there, and then they take them out of the trash and recycle them and put them force them on people of Afghanistan. So this last debacle in Afghanistan, that the withdrawal of the US troops in Afghanistan, it's not that I, as a peace activist, as once being a member of the peace action, I am not for military intervention. I did not want any war. I did not want the US to stay there. But once they were there should have been a more responsible withdrawal from there. But unfortunately, what the US did over the years, when Karzai was in power, or after Ghani was in power, they sidelined the Afghan government. They undermined the Afghan government. They made decisions with the warlords. They were meeting with the warlords. I mean, think about it. If Mexico, the Mexican ambassador or any other ambassador comes here and meet with the opposition of the US government, this is so undiplomatic. But in a country where there is war going on, the US ambassador, the military, the high ranked military people, they would be meeting with the opposition of the government. And of course, every time they meet with them, they would give them more relevancy, they would give them more power, and then the warlords would be asking for more and more position, or for more. They wanted their interests to be considered by the government more than the interests of the people. So they were forcing government to listen to them and reply or respond to their need, to the warlords' needs. And after 9/11, when US went there, they did not even really disarm people. What happened, some of the old weapons were kind of collected. They would call them withdraw, but disarm, but that was not. And then instead they sold them new weapons. Of course, somebody in the military machines, in the big military weapon companies were making money by giving them new weapons. So over the years, there were, in every election, the US intervened. The election of 2014 and then the election of 2019, when Mr. Ghani won the two elections, US forced Mr. Ghani to accept the warlords Abdullah. It was like a government with two heads. And of course, 50% were the warlords already. And then the other 50% that they inherited, the government of Afghanistan inherited from the previous government, were corrupt people. And every time, because the warlords became so powerful, so rich, filthy rich, you probably have seen some of the pictures of their palaces. It was really, they became very rich, with that $2.5 trillion that the US is talking about. Some was given to the contractors, some was given to the warlords, and the people, the 98% of the Afghans did not benefit from it. But the US was undermining and sidelining the Afghan government, and forcing actually the Afghan government in a way to give very sensitive military and security positions to the people who had no interest in Afghanistan, who had no interest in the people. They had just their own interest, their own warlordism and drugs and making money, and US were supporting them. So that way, the government really did become weak, because if there is war against the Taliban and there are not very friendly neighbors and they're bombing, dropping on you from the US, and then there are internal warlords who are also always asking for more and more, the Afghan government did become weak. But this the deal that was done by, was signed by Mr. Trump almost 2 years ago, it was a really shameless deal, and then that shameless deal was signed by Biden. Some people say what Biden could have done. Why not? He could have done a lot. Trump signed a lot of deals, but Biden, when he came to power, got rid of them. So he could have done that too, but instead he did not do it, and he wants to blame Trump for it. I don't care who is blamed for. As far as I know, as far as the people from outside see both. If it's an orbit in front of them or is a D in front of them, they see the foreign policy the same. It does not change very much. The foreign policy does not change if there is a Democrat or the Republican. And the question that people have and the anger that they are saying that use with all the might, with the military that they have, with the technology that they have, with the money that they have, the bragging that they do, they couldn't withstand the Taliban, a medieval group, just a few thousand people. They couldn't get rid of terrorism. The US keeps supporting terrorism in Afghanistan for the past 40 plus years, and especially in the last 20 years. Taliban were not even strong. Before 9/11, Taliban was not a very strong entity. But after 9/11, after the Taliban they lost power, they became very strong. But if we really were serious about the war on terror that we are talking about, or we went to Afghanistan, because of the war on terror. First of all, the 19 people who flew the airplane, they were not Afghan, they were from Saudi Arabia, and they were trained here, and they were from the former allies of the United States. They were the people that the US trained, supported, even from Virginia to North Carolina to Pakistan to in Afghanistan. And then when they went to Afghanistan and they invaded Afghanistan under the war on terror. So going and bombing the poor people who don't have enough to eat, that doesn't help to fight terrorism. Actually, that helps terrorism, because when you bomb them from above and then there are terrorists there, the local people, where would they go? So they cannot fly, they cannot come to the US. They just have to join hands with the Taliban. Another thing is, if they were really serious about fighting the terrorism, they should have gone after the sanctuary, after the training camps of those Taliban that were the terrorists. Now they are saying that they're bombing ISIS, but you probably heard it, and I actually sent some pictures to Cole and others. That they were children. There were 10 children in a family that they got killed. Just regular people. The children, they're ISIS, they're terrorists. So that is what has been going on all these years. With this debacle, the recent debacle that the US did, that they couldn't, again, I just say that with all their might, they couldn't save their own citizens. They couldn't save their own allies that they were working with them, so loyal, working with them. And they they just got out and left even the documents. They couldn't even save their documents. The Afghans said one thing, not several things, of course. They said that the US used Afghans for 40 years. And then they used another word, but I would just say spit. Then they spit on Afghans. That's what they have been using Afghans, and then they're spitting on it. And then they just put like the 35 million people on a silver plate. They just handing them to the Taliban terrorists that US themselves called them terrorists, and they fought them so-called for 20 years. One of the things that I'm hearing about this debacle that they called, maybe US did not have all the power and the might that they are talking about. So they're bragging about. So they call them Babri Kaghazi. Babri Kaghazi is the paper tiger. The tiger that made out of paper. Maybe the whole US might is just that. And people are angry, but they're also wondering what is going on. Why would the US do this to 35 million people? Why would the US get rid of an elected government while they always use our democracy and human rights and elections and equality and women's rights? They use these slogans to for the world, but then they step on all the slogans and put Afghanistan, give them to the Taliban. It is, someone actually wrote the other day, said that being US enemy is difficult, it's very costly, but being US's allies is deadly. And that is what happened to the people of Afghanistan. So there are a lot of, we hear a lot in the mainstream media, they're the cheerleader for war, they were the cheerleader for war before, they're the cheerleader for any decision that any administration makes, depend on what media, what paper, either the liberals or the right-wingers. So they are the cheerleader. They don't tell you the truth. They don't tell you the actual history, the true history of the country. But I will give you three names, three books. Actually, Val writes very well, and I have read some of her writing. It's really wonderful and talks about the truth. But two of my dear friends, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gold, they have two books actually. One is The Invisible History, the Afghanistan Untold Story. Please, if you can read that, it will tell you that the US intervention in Afghanistan that started way before the 9/11, way before even the Soviet before 79, before the Soviet entering Afghanistan. And the new book is also coming out, is The Valediction, which I read only part of it. It's really good. There's also another book called The Ghost War by Steve Cole. If you read that, it is clearly the secret history of the CIA involvement in Afghanistan, all the way from the 70s to 2001. So maybe if we could just enlighten, if you could just learn about the true history, the real history, and about the involvement in the intervention of the US, what the US does in our name and other countries, how many regime changes they did. I mean, you just think about from 53, from Iran to the 73 in Chile, and then, I mean, just on and on and on, even just recent, not recently, actually, that's 20 years ago, in Haiti, and then Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and everywhere else that they are doing regime change. Just what they don't like in the regime, just what they don't like the head of a government, then they change them. The other day, Kai Aidi wrote something that Ashraf Ghani was unfit. I said, there are a lot of unfit leaders in the world, but you don't go and replace them. Why would you go to Afghanistan and replace Ashraf Ghani? He was elected. Even if he was unfit, he was elected by the people. And you think the Taliban are better, that you are bringing Taliban there to power? And what happened to the human rights and women's rights that you were always screaming about? What is going on right now? It's really a human tragedy there. It's a human tragedy of the century. I hope this doesn't, that this tragedy does not repeat itself anywhere. But Afghans are really in danger. They are in the hand of the most notorious terrorist fundamentalist group, that they don't have any respect for law and order or human rights or anything. But that can change, because pressure on the government can change. Sanction on the government can change. Involvement with talk with the government, that can change. Conversation, that can change. Bringing refugees out of Afghanistan, of course, people are in danger. Right now, I have 50 people in my list. They are just going from one home to another home, from one district to another district, and from one province to another province. They're just in hiding. They don't have any place to go, and they want to get out. And I am working on it to get them out. That is fine. But there are 35 million people. So, okay, a few thousand people leave Afghanistan, and few thousand are mostly they have education or they're progressive, and so they leave Afghanistan, and then the 35 million people are left with the Taliban. So we forget about Afghanistan again. So the U.S. we should also ask the U.S. to please do not intervene. Military intervention in any country would not help those people. The money that we spend, the money that the Pentagon spend on the military, 1/10 of it would have built Afghanistan, Iraq, even Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, and all that region. 1/10 of it, but they have not done that. They did not want to do it because somebody there in the big military complex, they make a lot of money, and they don't care what happened to the poor people. And 35 million people, that is not 35 people, that's 35 million people. So to spit on them, to excuse my language, I have to use that because I'm really to shit on them. It is really appalling. It is beyond inhumane what we are doing in the country where call themselves the champion of democracy, the champion of human rights and women's rights and this and that, and put sanction on that country and this country because they don't respect human rights. So we ourselves, this country, the United States, stepped on every human rights and women's rights, on every morality and ethic. We stepped on them, and we just forgot a whole nation. We have broken a whole nation, not just once, not twice, for the past 40 plus years. So we are trying to help people there on the ground. We are trying to evacuate some people to bring them to safety. And I'm hoping that, they will go back and build the country. I have left Afghanistan 40 years ago, and I have gone many, many, many times and built many schools and many, try to help people. Well, I'm hoping that those people who are out, who are dedicated people, they will go back and build the country. But for now, we need to save their lives. And our organization also helps there on the ground. We have volunteers who are helping on the ground, Afghan Women's Fund. And we also trying to bring these people out that at least that they can be safe, they can be alive. And then maybe one day they go back and help people there. So, I think my time is probably up. I probably should stop, and then I will be happy to answer to any question. Thank you so very much for joining us, and thank you for having me here, the Peace Action. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahima, and thank you for reiterating the crocodile tears that our government sheds over women's rights and electoral rights in some countries and conveniently ignores in many places around the world. But thank you, and our hearts go out to your family and close friends that are still there and hoping to come out. So now I think I saw a few hands raised, and I think if Brian sees those, we have about 15 minutes left. I think we can probably entertain several questions. Brian?
Sure. The first hand I saw go up belongs to Michael Hoey, and I will ask Michael to unmute and just let everyone know that you can raise your digital hand using the reactions button and then click raised hand, and you'll be put online. So Michael, I'm going to ask you to unmute and go ahead, ask your first question. Please keep it brief.
Okay, the question I have is for Erik. There was a guy that was part of the Beirut bombing in '83. Igal Mukayeh, I think he was part of Hezbollah and Hamas. And we hunted him down. I think it took us 25 years, but we killed him in Syria in 2008. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking there's probably dozens of people on list of men that we're hunting down. And I'm wondering if it's going to be the same thing in Afghanistan. Are we going to continue to have our execution squads focus on men in that part of the world to use drones to kill them?
I honestly have no idea. I think that probably the Biden administration is maybe slightly less drone happy than some of the other administrations before, but I don't have an answer. Sorry, Michael.
Thanks, Eric. Just quickly before we go to Phil, who has the next hand up, you answered this in the chat, but I thought it was a great question and a great answer, so I wanted everyone to hear it. Min asked, did the 20-year war on terror do anything to reduce global terrorism? Eric, can you reiterate your answer? That
Yeah,
you gave
sure. I mean, absolutely not. I mean, there's no objective measure that this has been at all helpful. If you look at sort of number of global deaths by terrorism since 2001, they've gone up. It hasn't really helped anything in the United States either. I mean, the US remains fairly low. And, you know, if you're talking about deaths by terrorism, you're more likely to die by your own furniture falling on you, according to the Atlantic. So, you know, be more careful about moving that sofa than worrying about a foreign-born terrorist. You're more likely to die of bees or dog bites, you know, than a foreign-born terrorist. And it also seems like as a country, we're far more concerned about spending trillions of dollars against the notion that you're going to get blown up by a foreign-born terrorist than either domestic terrorism here, just regular old vanilla gun violence, or far larger threats to human safety, i.e. climate change or any number of other things, which is a far larger thing that we should be worried about. So place your assets on things that matter and actually reduce risk rather than those that are just salacious and exciting in the news.
Let me add something to that, because you know, the so-called U.S. war on terror was quite you know, self-defeating, and it was quite hypocritical given that the U.S. Actually helped spawn international Islamist radicalism, extremism, and terrorism through the support of the Mujahideen in the 1980s, and the fact that Osama bin Laden got his training during that war, towards the end of the war. And I should also add that many countries, many Muslim majority countries, by the way, Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, Lebanon, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, those countries suffered after the defeat of the Red Army troops and the Afghan military, because jihadists from those countries had gone to fight with the Mujahideen in the 1980s in Afghanistan, and then they came back to their countries of birth and wreaked havoc there. So thank you, America, for helping to spawn terrorism during the 1980s and early 1990s.
But actually, in the last 20 years, terrorism became much stronger. Here, we just say we went there to fight the terrorism, got rid of the Taliban terrorists, then we put them back there in power. So we replaced the Taliban with the Taliban, and they have not changed. I mean, what makes you think that Taliban have changed when they were still, just like up to 4 or 5 weeks ago, they were blowing themselves, the schools and in the school and colleges and mosques, and killing innocent people and just targeting people. I mean, why would they think the Taliban changed? Just because they were not killing the US? The US had a deal with them. Yes, they did, but the thousands and thousands of Afghan, like 100,000 of Afghan army got killed, and just civilian, thousands and thousands of civilian got killed. And why would they say that the war on terror was successful?
Thanks to all the panelists for your answers. Next, I'm going to bring Phil onto the screen for your question. Let me put you up. Go ahead, Phil.
Oh, there you go. Hi. Okay. With all of the reports from Afghanistan, there's been obviously a lot of chaos over there. There was the terrible suicide bomber at the airport, And I've heard other reports of people being beaten or being harassed throughout the country. I'm listening very carefully on that because my understanding is that there's the Taliban, but there's a lot of different thinking groups within the Taliban. Then you've got this ISIL-K, you've got the Mujahideen, and so it's unclear who's actually doing this violence. And the Taliban have said that there's amnesty and that there will be no retaliation. And they're saying, and so my question is, if in fact they establish a government, which of course is pretty chaotic right now, and if they want to have international recognition for being honorable and for not doing retaliation, isn't it fair to assume that after they get squared away, after there's a bit of structure established, after normal flight relations and so forth in and out of the airport happen, why isn't, or do you think it would be possible and likely that anybody in Afghanistan can file for a visa to travel to the United States or wherever they want to go, or any American there that wants to leave would just simply be able to file through normal procedures to get out of the country? That's my question.
Well, first of all, the Taliban have not changed. The violence has, it's still going on. And I just have to tell you that one of our volunteers was beaten up so much that they have sent me pictures of it. And another of our teacher, she was molested in front of her family. So another volunteer was killed just because he was a sculptor and making statues, and they called him idol worshiper. Another volunteer committed suicide because one of his family members was killed before by the Taliban, and he said it's better to kill myself than being dead in the hand of the Taliban. So another one was a teacher was shot on her spine. She's still in the coma now. It's like almost 2 weeks. So and these are people that I know by name and family and last name and have their phone numbers. But there are others that the pictures are on Twitter and Facebook that you see that they're just on the street and beating up. And so if there are many groups of the Taliban, maybe there are many groups, but they're all the same. Taliban, Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIS, Daesh, they're all those people who the US supported in the 80s, and then they fractioned, they branched out, and then they formed many different groups in different countries. They have different names. So it is not just their attire, their name, it is their school of thought in their brain, their head, which is filled with the same crap. Sorry.
Oh, thanks for your candor. Unless there's any other comments, I'm going to move on to Kim.
I'm happy to say a quick.
Go ahead, Erik.
Which I imagine that this time around, the Taliban would probably prefer to be recognized as a government, receive the wealth and approval of other countries. It seems like they're cozying up more towards Russia and China. Instead, obviously, than sort of Western countries like the US, and that it would be better to be seen as a slightly more in line with norms, even though that still is used very loosely, and be rich, as opposed to sanctioned, have a brutal country and have mass reprisals. What does that mean, though, on the ground? I still think it's going to be extremely repressive. I think there's still be murders and violence, although it may be sort of reprisal light, short of crimes against humanity. This is, I imagine, still not a pleasant place to be, and there will still be murders of interpreters and former Afghan officials. Regarding the interpreters and sort of the return to commercial flights, if it were easy to just come to the United States, my interpreter would have done that years ago. I had no problem paying for his plane ticket. That wasn't the issue. The United States wouldn't let him onto the ground. So it's not about that. His special immigrant visa has been in basically purgatory, as I said, for 5 years. So he just can't even come here. And I'm looking for solutions to find him third-party country visas I have a friend who's trying to help me out to see if he can get basically refugee status in Switzerland for a year. And then maybe during that time, we can like sort out an immigration lawyer to see if he can push through the rest of his visa to come to the United States. There is no good solution here for people like my interpreter, who I have to refer to as Rock rather than using his real name. The best case scenario is that he gets to a place like Switzerland and then gets to the United States. Meanwhile, he will have abandoned his wife and children in Kunduz, and they will then have to appeal as well. And that might be another year, you know, or something like that until they end up meeting up again. And the worst case scenario is he goes back to his home city of Kunduz and gets murdered in front of his family. So there's no good solution here.
Thanks. Next, I'm gonna call on Kim. If you can unmute yourself, go ahead with your question. Thank you.
Very quick question. From the title of this talk or this webinar, do you guys really think that the US government and the administration wants to learn any lessons from Afghanistan? I mean, really, you know?
I suppose let's go to Val first, since you didn't answer the last question.
I actually agree with the subtext of the question, which is no, I don't think the U.S. is going to, the U.S. decision makers, policy makers, the people in, the leadership of the two parties, no, they haven't learned any lessons and they won't learn any lessons. As Fahima was, pointing out, from 1953 and actually 54 Guatemala, 56 Suez, and on, 73, Central Asia, and then most recently, the appalling response to the Arab Spring, for example, more destabilization of states, Libya, Syria, and so on, not to mention Iraq. They never, ever, oh, sorry, I didn't even, I forgot about Vietnam. I mean, they will never learn the lessons. It's really something. Now, I was in Iran when there was an anti-war movement in this country. I wasn't part of it. I think some of the people who are, listening in were part of the American anti-war movement. I myself wonder why Americans can't get their act together and really build another strong movement that holds their politicians and frankly, their corporate heads to account for the appalling foreign policies of the past decades and for the unbelievable income inequality in this country and for, let's say, what is going on in Louisiana today. I mean, this morning I woke up, I heard the news about Louisiana. I turned to my husband and I said, America is a third world country with a big military, huge income inequality, and a dreadful infrastructure. I mean, when are they ever going to learn the lessons? I don't know. It's up to us, the people, to build a strong enough movement and set of strong organizations to be able to hold these politicians and these corporate heads to account. Otherwise, nothing is going to change.
Can I add something to this?
Surely.
So one of the things that I noticed for years and years that the ruling class, they don't care about the national interest. For them, national interest is just the interest of few big corporations in the military complex. And so that is their interest. So when we don't think about the interest of 98%, we don't care. I mean, the US, the ruling class really does not care. They just go and make their money somewhere and then they get out of there and then they go and make their money somewhere else and then they get out of there. And just there are a few hundred families or there are a few hundred or there are a small percentage, they get rich and then they get out of there. What happened to the world, they don't care. They are rich, that the military is in their service and the police is in their service, that the weapons are in their hand and they keep producing, keep selling them, and then they go and invade a country or just regime change or so, they're getting out. Unless we have a government that to think about the national interest, the government that is just the ruling class, that it's just in the pocket of big corporation, they will never learn, because for them, the only thing that's in their head is how to make money, how to become, to be powerful. That's it. Only for that few hundred families or the few thousand families or whatever, you know, the numbers are there. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, I'm going to pass it over to Anne. If you can unmute yourself, I'll bring you up on the screen and you can ask me your question. Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, is that me? All right.
Yep.
Some people are calling for the U.S. to leave the embassy open to continue assisting Afghans who aided the U.S. to get out of the country. Given our deplorable history of hypocrisy and actually doing anything to help the people, given the fact that we lost the war and are not really in a position to call the shots here, do you think there's any point in doing that? And wouldn't, in my opinion, wouldn't that entail leaving military there and otherwise extending the war further? So what I want to know from you is, what do you think U.S. peace groups at this point should call for concretely that would actually be of benefit to the people of Afghanistan?
Who are you asking?
Everybody.
I would say that to leave the embassy there to help some people, yes, it will help some people, but it won't solve the Afghanistan problem. Like I said earlier, there are 35 million people. They are in danger. They're in the hand of the terrorists. Just leaving embassy there for a few more weeks or even for a few months or whatever time, that would not solve the problem, because there is no plan for the country. They have given, the plan was they have given the country in the hand of the terrorists. So it would not help the 35 million people there. We have to have a plan to help the 35 million people. You cannot bring the 35 million people out of Afghanistan. I wish we could, but you cannot do that. That's not possible. So it has to be a plan to help those people there.
Erik, Val, do you have thoughts?
Well, I did mention some of the responsibility of the U.S. For helping to broker a regional peace building, security, and development plan. Russia and China, and I think Iran, have a stake in this, and they are likely to be they have been talking to the Taliban to try to make sure that there is some kind of peaceful path forward. And I think the role of Russia and China will be quite different than that of the United States in Afghanistan going forward. But we have to wait and see. I mean, some of the news coming out of Afghanistan is quite dreadful, as Fahimeh has been saying. There seems to be some kind of difference between some of the Taliban leadership who, claim that they have become more moderate, and others claim that they are moderate, and then the Taliban guys on the ground who seem to be intimidating people and molesting and harassing and killing and so on. So it's very unclear what this new Taliban government regime might look like. Frankly, the very fact that they're not even calling themselves a republic, they're calling themselves an emirate, not even an Islamic republic like the Islamic Republic of Iran, but rather the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, actually, I think bodes ill. But on the other hand, it may be that the Russians and the Chinese and maybe the Iranians, Indians, and some others might be able to change them and might be able to encourage them, urge them, or maybe even intimidate them into having a more inclusive government, and one that is respectful of women, girls, the Shia, Hazara, and others. I don't know about ISIS, but again, ISIS came out of Iraq and the dreadful American invasion and occupation of Iraq, and also the destabilization of Syria. And so the U.S. still has a lot to answer for. So again, the U.S. has to pay into a trust fund for peace building, and social, economic, and infrastructural development in Afghanistan. That country, there was one window of opportunity for Afghanistan to enter the 20th century and to catch up to some extent to its neighbors. That was when the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was in place. Unfortunately, Carter, Brzezinski, and then Reagan and the rest of them decided that they didn't want that to happen, and then they just created this quagmire and these years of chaos in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and then into the 90s. I mean, that was the one window of opportunity. Let's see if there will be another window of opportunity, this time possibly with the assistance, with the help, with the encouragement of some of the neighbors. But that would mean that the US has to stay out and only finance some of those development projects, educational projects, and so on. Thanks.
Thanks, Val. Brian, let's take one more question just to be respectful of time. We're a few minutes over what we said, but there's obviously a lot of interest here. There's still 176 people on the Zoom. So, but one more question, Brian, and then I think we'll have to wrap.
I think that sounds right. So the final question goes to you, Janet. Let me bring you up on screen and you can ask our panelists your question.
Thank you, panelists, for a very good and informative panel. And I have a question about sanctions. I put this in the chat too. Some organizations are calling for sanctions or reimposition of, for example, the UN Security Council sanctions, which were directed towards individual Taliban members, whereas the EU and the US tend to impose general sanctions. Are there any scenarios in which sanctions would be favorable to Afghani people, or no?
No. Sanction usually hurt the ordinary people. Sanction does not hurt the ruling class, the rich people. The poor people are the ones suffering. We remember Iraq, the sanction on Iraq, the sanction on Iran, sanction on every country that was there. The people have suffered. Yes, sanction on some of the Taliban leaders, that I agree with, but not on the people.
We've discussed sanctions a great deal within Mass Peace Action. We've had several webinars on the sanctions against Iran. There will be a sanctions curriculum, anti-sanctions curriculum, frankly, that will be made available soon. And there's consensus that we oppose sanctions. Sanctions do not work. Sanctions are war by other means. And on that note.
And on that note, I want to encourage everybody to attend in 3 days, where we have another fabulous lineup of policy experts and human rights activists, Kathy Kelly, Phyllis Bennis, and Chris Velasquez. And I think bring that question of sanctions, did I just go dead? Anyway, bring that question of sanctions to that evening's discussion as well. It's an important conversation. I remember Madeleine Albright being asked a question whether or not the lives that were lost due to sanctions were worth it 20 years ago, or maybe a little bit less than that. And Madeleine's, during the Clinton administration, and Madeleine's question was, yeah, I think it probably was worth it. And maybe that's a valid answer if it's not your child dying of hunger or your cousin dying for lack of health care. I think that this can be explored further. But if Erik doesn't have anything to add to that, I will thank everybody still on the call for their attendance, encourage you to come back. And I want to say one last thing. When the question was asked, did we learn anything? It's not important that the current power brokers in Washington, D.C. learn anything, because they're not going to. It's important that we learn the lessons and that we take an extra hour an extra day, an extra week out of our lives to organize around this and not be afraid to talk to our friends and neighbors who aren't as educated, who didn't spend 2 hours with us tonight. Because if we don't change the narrative in the American electorate, it ain't going to change from the top down. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And have a great night. And we'll see you all again on Thursday, I hope.
فهمه جان خداحافظ. خوشحال شدم.
صحبت میکنیم.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Take care.
Bye, everybody.